My entire reputation is built on the promise that I do not make mistakes. I deal in load-bearing walls, stress tests, and the kind of absolute, unflinching precision that keeps skyscrapers from swaying in the wind. I don't do chaos. I don't do ambiguity. And I certainly never let my gaze wander where it strictly shouldn't. But Naomi Levy wasn't just a client. She was a storm front wrapped in tailored wool and silence. One accidental glance at the hidden ink on her ribcage was all it took to unravel a decade of ironclad professional discipline. It started with a blueprint, a reach, and a slip of silk. In the rarefied air of high-stakes architectural consulting, my name is synonymous with control. Billionaires and corporations hire me when they want their legacies cast in concrete and glass, when they need someone who can translate their massive egos into a skyline without cracking under the pressure. I have rules, strict ones. I don't drink with clients, I don't discuss my personal history, and I definitely don't let the friction of a boardroom turn into anything warmer than polite detachment. My work is my fortress, and I keep the drawbridge up. Then came Naomi. She was the CEO of a tech conglomerate that was currently eating the market alive. A woman who treated skyscrapers like software, something to be optimized, debugged, and stripped of any romantic inefficiency. Our first meeting was in my studio, a space I designed to be intimidatingly sterile. Most clients walk in and lower their voices in reverence. Naomi walked in, ran a hand over the drafting table, and immediately critiqued the light filtration system. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city she intended to conquer, and I felt the air in the room change instantly. It thickened, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just her presence, though that was formidable enough. It was the scent of her, something cool and expensive, like rain on hot pavement mixed with the sharp tang of ozone. She turned to me, her eyes dark and assessing, and told me my initial renderings for her penthouse were structurally sound but emotionally hollow. That was the beginning of the war. For 3 weeks, we battled over every line on the schematics. She challenged my choices on materials, questioned the flow of the living spaces, and demanded justifications for angles I had used for years without complaint. She was relentless. In any other client, I would have found it exhausting, a reason to terminate the contract. With her, it was intoxicating. There is a specific kind of seduction and competence, and Naomi Levy was the most competent person I had ever met. She wore her authority like a second skin, comfortable and heavy. We spent hours in that conference room, the silence stretching between us like a merger agreement waiting to be signed. I found myself watching her hands as she gestured at the blueprints. They were elegant, manicured, and decisive. When she pointed out a flaw, she didn't just identify it. She dissected it with a surgeon's cruelty. I realized quickly that she wasn't just trying to undermine me. She was testing the structural integrity of my confidence. She wanted to know if I would break under the weight of her expectations or if I would stand firm. I didn't break. I pushed back. I defended my designs with the same cold logic she used to dismantle them. And every time I won a point, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not defeat, but respect. Maybe even a dark amusement. It was a dangerous game. The professional distance I prized so highly began to feel less like a wall and more like a thin sheet of glass. I could see right through it to the heat radiating off her. I told myself it was just intellectual stimulation. I told myself I was just admiring the sharp edges of her mind, the ruthless efficiency of her ambition. But deep down, in the quiet moments after she left, and the room still smelled of her stillness, I knew I was lying. I found myself replaying the cadence of her voice, the way she leaned in when she wanted to intimidate, the way the light hit her throat. I wanted to know what lay beneath that armor of bespoke suits and icy stares. She was a puzzle I wasn't paid to solve. Until the afternoon, the light caught her off guard. The rain had started to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my studio, turning the city outside into a gray, smeared, abstract painting. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but abstract. It was sharp, defined by the friction of two wills grinding against each other. We were 40 minutes into a heated debate about the structural supports for the penthouse's floating staircase. Naomi Levy didn't want supports. She wanted magic. She wanted the stairs to look like they were hovering, untethered by physics or common sense. I was trying to explain, for the third time that afternoon, that steel had weight, and gravity wasn't a suggestion she could negotiate with. "You're thinking like an engineer, not an artist," she said. She was standing on the other side of the drafting table, her hands resting on the dark wood. Her knuckles were white. She was frustrated, and frankly, so was I. But where my frustration made me quiet and cold, hers made her kinetic. She paced. She tapped her fingers. She radiated a restless, caged energy that made the large room feel suddenly very small. "I am an engineer," I corrected, keeping my voice level, clinging to my professional detachment like a life raft. "That's why you pay me, to make sure your artistic vision doesn't collapse on top of you during your housewarming party." She stopped pacing. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. She wore a blouse of deep charcoal silk that day, something fluid and expensive that moved like water over her frame. It was tucked into high-waisted trousers, the epitome of corporate armor. It was a look designed to repel intimacy, to project nothing but competence and wealth. But the armor was about to slip. "It won't collapse," she insisted, leaning in. "Look at the stress tests on the composite materials." She reached across the table. It was a sudden, aggressive movement. She wanted to point to a specific load-bearing calculation on the far side of the schematic, right in front of where I sat. She stretched her arm out, her body angling sharply over the surface. It was a reach that ignored personal space, a reach that demanded I look at what she was showing me. But I didn't look at the blueprint. As she extended her arm, the movement pulled the silk of her blouse taut. The hem, which had been perfectly tucked, caught on the edge of the table and rode up. It was a smooth, silent betrayal of fabric. The dark silk lifted high on her left side, exposing a stretch of skin that shouldn't have been visible in a boardroom. It was the tender, pale skin of her inner ribcage, a place usually hidden by layers of wool and propriety. And on that pale skin, there was ink. It wasn't a small, cute symbol hidden away. It was a bold, black, serrated shape. I saw sharp angles, heavy lines, a geometric violence etched directly into the tender flesh over her ribs. It looked like a fracture, or a weapon. The design disappeared up under the silk, toward her breast and down into the waistband of her trousers, implying a massive, sprawling piece of art that she kept entirely hidden from the world. It was the kind of ink that required pain to acquire, hours of needlework on bone. It spoke of a tolerance for suffering I hadn't attributed to her. The contrast was shocking. The woman who demanded clean lines and transparency in her buildings was walking around with a chaotic, dark secret carved into her skin. I stared. I couldn't help it. My eyes were fixed on that flash of black ink against white skin. It felt intimate, illicit, like I had walked in on her naked. I was seeing the crack in the facade, the thing that didn't fit the spreadsheet. The moment stretched, heavy and thick. Naomi must have felt the draft, or maybe she just felt the weight of my attention. She froze. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't gasp. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her arm. The silk slid back down, obscuring the tattoo, returning her to the pristine executive she was supposed to be. But she didn't retreat. She lifted her head and met my gaze. Her eyes were dark, dilated slightly. She knew I had seen it. She knew I was currently rewriting everything I thought I knew about her. And instead of looking away, instead of apologizing or making a joke, she held my stare. There was no embarrassment in her expression, only a cool, predatory assessment of my reaction. She was waiting to see if I would flinch. It was a challenge. It was a silent acknowledgement of the breach. The air in the room didn't just shift, it snapped, charged with the secret I now held. I did the only thing I knew how to do in a crisis. I retreated into the safety of mathematics. I cleared my throat, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet of the studio, and tried to pull my gaze back to the blueprints. I started talking about load coefficients and tensile strength, about the sheer impossibility of suspending that much weight without a visible anchor. But the words felt hollow in my mouth, like dry leaves. I was reciting a manual, but my mind was still stuck on that flash of black ink against the pale arch of her ribs. The numbers, usually my greatest comfort, refused to line up. I stumbled over a calculation I could have done in my sleep a week ago. Naomi didn't interrupt me. She didn't point out that I was rambling or that my voice had lost its usual steely cadence. She just watched. The frustration that had been vibrating off her moments ago had evaporated, replaced by something far more unsettling. She looked amused. It was the look of a predator who realizes the prey isn't just cornered, but fascinated by the teeth. She knew she had disrupted my equilibrium. She picked up her pen, tapped it once against the table, a sharp, final sound, and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a recognition of a shift in power. "I think we're done for today," she said, her voice smooth, devoid of the earlier friction. "Send me the revised specs, and try to be a little more flexible." When she left, the silence she left behind was heavy. I sat there for an hour, the lights of the city turning on outside my window, unable to work. I kept seeing it, that jagged, dark shape. It didn't make sense. Naomi Levy was clean lines and polished surfaces. She was a woman who lived her life in high-definition transparency. That tattoo was chaos. It was primitive. It looked like shattered glass or a collapsing building, etched permanently into the most sensitive skin on her body. Why? Why endure that kind of pain for something no one sees? It was a contradiction that gnawed at me. I analyzed it like a structural flaw in a foundation, turning it over and over, trying to find the logic. That night, the dynamic changed. Usually, our communication was strictly channeled through my assistant or formal project management software. But at 11:42 p.m., my personal phone lit up on the nightstand. It was an email from her private address. No subject line, no "Dear Architect," just a link to an article about brutalist architecture in post-war Europe and a single line of text. "This reminds me of your stubbornness." My thumb hovered over the screen. The professional protocol, the rule I had written for myself in stone, was to ignore it, respond during business hours, keep the boundary. But the blue light of the phone felt like a tether in the dark. She was awake, thinking about me, or at least thinking about our argument. I lay there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic, feeling the pull of it. It was a test. If I replied, I was acknowledging that I was accessible. I was admitting that she occupied my headspace outside of the billable hours. I opened the article, I read it, and then, against every instinct that had kept my career safe for 10 years, I typed a reply. "Brutalism is about honesty and materials," I wrote. "It's not stubbornness. It's integrity." The response came 3 minutes later. "Integrity is just a nice word for rigidity. You're afraid of the curve." We traded messages for an hour. The conversation wasn't explicitly intimate, yet it felt incredibly illicit. We were discussing concrete and steel, but the subtext was entirely about us, about control, about bending, about what happens when hard surfaces collide. Her tone was teasing, stripped of the CEO formality, intimate in its directness. She was inviting me into the dark with her, peeling back the corporate persona to show me the mind that matched the ink. I lay in the dark, the phone warm in my hand, my heart beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with architecture. I told myself it was client management, but my pulse told a different story. 3 days later, the digital intimacy of our late-night emails collided with the violent reality of a construction site. We met at the penthouse shell at 2 p.m. The building was still a skeleton, a massive cage of raw concrete and exposed rebar rising 50 stories above the street. It was a place of deafening noise and swirling dust, an environment that usually stripped people of their pretenses. But Naomi Levy arrived looking like she had just walked out of a board meeting, which she likely had. She wore a trench coat the color of heavy cream, belted tight, and beneath it the sharp lines of a navy suit. And, because she was Naomi, she was wearing stilettos, 4-inch spikes of black patent leather that looked like weapons. I met her by the freight elevator, wearing my own armor, steel-toed boots, jeans, and a hard hat. The contrast between us was almost comical. I was dressed for the work. She was dressed for the finished product. I handed her a hard hat, which she accepted with a look of mild disdain, placing it over her hair without ruining the style. "You can't walk the floor in those," I said, gesturing to her heels. The floor was an obstacle course of conduit pipes, uneven concrete pours, and debris. "It's a liability." "I have excellent balance," she replied, her voice barely audible over the scream of a circular saw somewhere on the floor below. She didn't wait for my permission. She stepped off the lift and into the dust-choked air of the penthouse. We had to move deeper into the structure to inspect the framing for the master suite. The noise was a physical weight, a constant, grinding roar that forced us into a proximity that felt dangerous. To be heard, I had to lean in close to her ear. To hear her, she had to tilt her head toward mine. It was a forced intimacy, dictated by the environment, but exploited by the tension between us. Every time I leaned in, I caught that scent of hers, cool rain and ozone, cutting through the smell of wet cement and sawdust. She navigated the rough terrain with a terrifying grace, stepping over bundles of wire and skirting puddles of standing water without looking down. But the sight was unpredictable. We reached the area where the floating staircase, the subject of our argument, would eventually be anchored. The floor here was particularly uneven, a mess of loose gravel and dropped tools. Naomi took a step toward the edge of the slab, wanting to see the view. Her heel caught on a ridge of uneven concrete. It was a small slip, a momentary loss of friction, but on a construction site, that's all it takes. Her ankle turned. She pitched slightly to the left. I moved before I thought. It was pure instinct, the reflex of someone who has spent years catching falling objects. I stepped in and wrapped my arm around her waist to steady her. My hand landed firmly on her side, right in the curve between her hip and her ribs. The contact was electric. Through the thick fabric of her trench coat and the blazer beneath, I felt the heat of her body. But more than that, I felt the location. My palm was pressed directly over the spot where I had seen the ink 3 days ago. I knew, with a vivid, sickening clarity, that beneath the layers of wool and silk, the jagged black lines of that tattoo were right under my fingers. I was holding the secret. She didn't pull away. She regained her balance instantly, her body tensing against mine, but she didn't step back. We stood there, frozen in the gray light of the unfinished room. The circular saw downstairs cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. My hand was still on her waist. Her shoulder was pressed against my chest. We were close enough that I could see the dust motes settling on her eyelashes. She turned her head slowly, looking up at me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were dark, dilated in the dim light. She looked at my hand, still gripping her waist, and then up to my face. She knew exactly what I was thinking. She knew I was mapping the hidden ink through her coat. "Stable," she said softly. The word had a double meaning that hung heavy in the air. I slowly loosened my grip, but I didn't remove my hand completely. I let it linger, for a second too long, a thumb brushing against the belt of her coat. "The foundation is solid," I replied, my voice rougher than I intended. "But the surface is treacherous if you're not paying attention." "I'm always paying attention," she murmured. She shifted, turning her body so she was facing me fully, forcing me to drop my hand. But she didn't retreat to a professional distance. She stayed inside my personal space, turning the dust and the raw concrete into our own private atmosphere. "That's why I hired you. You see the things that are buried." "I see the flaws," I said, trying to regain the high ground. "I see where things might break." "Or," she countered, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes, "you see the things that hold the structure together." She stepped back then, finally breaking the circuit. She turned to look out at the skyline, framed by the steel beams, as if the moment hadn't just altered the entire gravity of the room. I stood behind her, my hand still burning where I had touched her, realizing that the building wasn't the only thing with a dangerous, hidden architecture. She didn't step back. She stepped in, turning the dust into our own private atmosphere. The critical design emergency came in at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Naomi claimed the specifications for the master bath vanity were catastrophic, a word she used with the same gravity most people reserved for natural disasters. By the time she arrived at my studio, the rest of my staff had long since gone home, leaving the office in a state of suspended animation. The overhead fluorescents were off. The only light came from the desk lamps, and the glow of the city skyline pushing through the glass walls, painting the room in shades of amber and deep indigo. It became immediately apparent that the vanity was fine. The marble sourcing was impeccable, the measurements were exact. We both knew it. We sat there, the blueprints spread out between us, next to cartons of takeout that had gone cold an hour ago, pretending to care about the bevel of a mirror edge. But the pretense was thinning. The air in the studio felt heavy, pressurized, like the cabin of a plane before takeoff. For the first time since I'd met her, Naomi looked human. The relentless, polished machinery of her persona had slowed down. She had taken off her blazer, draping it over the back of her chair, leaving her in a sleeveless silk top that left her arms bare. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes from holding up the sky for too long. She wasn't sitting with her usual rigid posture. She was leaning back, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey, my whiskey, from the bottle I kept in the bottom drawer, dangling loosely in her hand. "You're meticulous," she said, breaking a silence that had lasted 5 minutes. She wasn't looking at the plans. She was watching me over the rim of her glass. It must be exhausting, living in a world where everything has to align perfectly. "Precision isn't exhausting," I replied, keeping my eyes on the drawings, though the lines were blurring. "Chaos is exhausting. Fixing mistakes is exhausting. Getting it right the first time is efficient." She laughed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated in the quiet room. "But where do you put the mess? Everyone has mess, even you." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, invading my space again. "Do you like hidden details in your architecture? Secret passages, priest holes, things only the architect knows about?" The subtext hit me like a physical blow. She was talking about the tattoo. She was circling back to the moment in the boardroom, the slip of silk, the glimpse of jagged black ink. She wanted to know if I was still thinking about it. "I believe in transparency," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "I don't build trapdoors." "Liar," she whispered. The word wasn't an accusation. It was a caress. "You build walls. That's the same thing." She reached out and tapped the schematic right over the master bedroom. "I have things I keep hidden. Structural reinforcements. You saw one." I finally looked up. Her eyes were locked on mine, dark and challenging. "I saw ink," I said. "Geometric. Heavy. It doesn't fit the brand." "It's not for the brand," she said softly. "It's for me. It's a reminder that even steel can be bent if you apply enough heat." The distance between us seemed to evaporate. We weren't talking about the building anymore. We were talking about the heat in the room, the friction that had been building for weeks. She shifted, the silk of her top whispering against her skin, and I tracked the movement. I imagined the ink continuing down her ribs, a secret map of pain and resilience that she carried into every boardroom. "Show me," I almost said. The words were right there, poised on my tongue. She tilted her head, her gaze dropping to my mouth. The silence stretched, turning electric. It was the kind of silence that precedes a crash. I could hear the hum of the server room down the hall, the beat of my own pulse in my ears. She leaned in closer. I didn't pull back. I wanted her to close the gap. I wanted to wreck the professionalism I had spent a decade building just to taste the chaos she offered. Her lips parted slightly. My hand moved on the table, inching toward hers. Then, the shrill digital trill of my office phone shattered the room. We both jumped. The spell didn't just break. It shattered into sharp, jagged pieces. Naomi pulled back instantly, her mask slamming back into place. I reached for the phone, my hand shaking, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The interruption saved my career, but it ruined my peace of mind. The project launch gala was held 3 weeks later. A glittering, deafening spectacle of ego and liquidity staged in the grand atrium of the city's modern art museum. This was the part of the job I despised. I built the stages, but I hated standing on them. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the cloying humidity of too many bodies pressed into a space designed for quiet contemplation. I stood near a limestone pillar, clutching a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking, watching the investors circle each other like sharks in tuxedos. They were there to celebrate the Levy Tower, to toast the skyline we were reshaping. But mostly they were there to be seen near the money. And the money was late. When Naomi finally arrived, the room didn't just quiet down. It seemed to tilt on its axis. She made an entrance that was less about arrival and more about impact. She was wearing a gown that should have been illegal in a room full of structural engineers because it defied physics. It was a column of liquid silver that clung to her frame like poured metal, high-necked and long-sleeved, seemingly modest, until she turned. The entire left side of the dress, from her armpit to her hip, was a sheer panel of illusion mesh. It was a masterstroke of provocation. To the casual observer, the investors, the press, the city council members, it was just high fashion, a daring glimpse of skin that hinted at vulnerability without giving anything away. But to me, it was a direct, private taunt. As she moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting accolades, the light caught the sheer fabric. I saw the shadow. I saw the faintest, ghostly edge of black ink rising from her ribs, obscured just enough to be deniable, but visible enough to burn into my retinas. She was wearing the secret. She was parading the very thing that had unraveled me in my office, hiding it in plain sight. I watched the men in the room watch her. They looked at her with a hunger that made my stomach turn, a mix of greed and lust. They saw the CEO, the power, the silhouette. They didn't see the fracture. They didn't know about the jagged geometry carved into her skin, the chaos she kept wrapped in silk and steel. A spike of possessive, irrational jealousy hit me so hard, I almost crushed the crystal stem in my hand. I wanted to cross the room and cover her. I wanted to tell them they were looking at a facade, and that I was the only one who had seen the blueprints. I tried to retreat, moving toward the terrace doors, needing the cold night air to clear the static from my head. I didn't make it. "You're inspecting the structural integrity of the exits," a voice said, right at my shoulder. I turned. Naomi was there. She had navigated the room with the same predatory grace she used on the construction site, cutting through the crowd to corner me in the shadow of an abstract sculpture. Up close, the dress was even more devastating. The sheer panel was a breath away from revealing everything. I forced my eyes to stay on her face, on the sharp line of her jaw and the dark intelligence of her eyes. "I am assessing the occupancy load," I lied, my voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of my heart. "It's crowded." "It's loud," she corrected, stepping into my personal space. She was too close for a gala, too close for a client. "And you've been avoiding my calls since the night the phone rang." "I've been busy," I said, "finalizing the permits." "You've been running," she murmured. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired of the game, tired of the noise around us. She looked at me with a terrifying clarity, stripping away the professional excuse I was trying to hold up between us. "You saw something you liked, and it scared you. You realize that I'm not just a checkbook and a deadline." "Naomi," I warned, glancing around. We were in a semi-private alcove, but we were still visible. "Don't," she said softly. Then she broke the rule. The one rule that kept the entire architecture of our relationship from collapsing into chaos. She reached out. In the middle of a room filled with cameras and board members, she raised her hand and brushed a stray lock of hair back from my temple. Her fingers lingered on my skin, cool and deliberate. It was a gesture of such casual, intimate familiarity that it felt louder than a scream. It was a claim. I froze. I should have stepped back. I should have laughed it off and turned away. But I couldn't. I leaned into her touch for a fraction of a second, a micro-surrender that she felt instantly. Her eyes darkened. "I'm tired of the walls," she whispered, her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone before she dropped her hand. "I want the architect who isn't afraid of the dark." She stepped back before I could respond, before I could find the breath to either deny her or confess everything. She turned back toward the crowd, the silver dress shimmering like a mirage. In a room full of investors, she was looking only at the architect of her distraction. 2 days after the gala, the sky over the city turned the color of a fresh bruise. We were scheduled for the final punch list walkthrough, a technical formality where I point out paint drips and misaligned outlet covers. It should have been a 20-minute affair, but the weather had other plans. We were on the 52nd floor, inside the completed glass box of the main living area, when the storm broke. It didn't start with a drizzle. It started with a wall of water slamming against the glazing, with enough force to make the steel frame vibrate beneath our feet. Then the power flickered. The emergency lights hummed to life, casting the room in a spectral gray gloom. I went to the elevator panel. Dead. The building's automated safety protocols had triggered a lockdown due to the wind shear. We were trapped in a glass cage, suspended in the middle of a hurricane. "We're stuck," I said, my voice sounding thin against the roar of the wind. I tapped the panel again, uselessly. The wind sensors locked the cars. It could be an hour before they reset. I expected Naomi to be annoyed. She had a board meeting at 4. Instead, she walked over to the massive window wall, staring out into the whiteout. She looked perfectly at ease, as if the storm was just another chaotic element she had brought with her. "An hour," she repeated, not turning around. "Just you, me, and the weather. No investors, no cameras, no exits." I stood by the elevator, my clipboard clutching to my chest like a shield. "I can call maintenance. They might be able to override it manually." "Put the phone away," she said. It was a command, low and smooth. She turned to face me. The gray light washed out the color in the room, turning everything into monochrome shadows. "Stop trying to fix it. Stop trying to manage the situation. For once, just be here." "I am here," I argued, though I stayed anchored to the wall. "I'm trying to ensure we get out." "You're trying to escape," she corrected. She began to walk toward me. The click of her heels was swallowed by the drumming of the rain. "You've been escaping since the moment you saw my tattoo. You retreat into your blueprints. You hide behind your professionalism. You ran away at the gala." "I didn't run. I removed myself from a compromising situation." "You ran," she said, stopping 3 feet from me. "Because you realize that your rules don't work on me. You realize that I'm not a building you can stabilize. And that terrifies you." "I'm not terrified," I lied. My heart was hammering against my ribs, echoing the chaotic rhythm of the rain. "I am a professional. I have boundaries because they are necessary for the work. You are a client. There are lines we cannot cross." "The lines are already gone," she whispered. She took another step. She was in my space now, the scent of her ozone and expensive perfume overwhelming the smell of the storm. She reached out, not to touch me, but to place her hand on the wall beside my head, boxing me in. "You feel it. I know you do. The friction. It's not just professional respect. It's heat." I looked at her. Her eyes were dark, searching. She wasn't mocking me now. She was demanding honesty. The storm raged outside, wild and uncontrollable, mirroring the panic rising in my chest. "Why are you so afraid of the mess?" she asked, her voice dropping to a hush. "Why do you need everything to be so perfect?" "Because if it's not perfect, it falls," I snapped, the truth tearing its way out of my throat. "Because chaos destroys things. I build structures that stand up. I don't let things collapse." "Some things need to collapse," she said, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then back to my eyes. "Some walls need to come down, so you can see what's actually inside." She leaned in. Her body was inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating off her, a stark contrast to the cold glass at my back. I wanted to push her away. I wanted to recite the code of ethics. But my hands remained at my sides, fingers curling into fists. I wasn't afraid of her. I was afraid that if I reached out, I wouldn't stop. I was afraid that the precision I clung to was nothing more than a dam holding back a flood, and she was the crack in the concrete. "Tell me to stop," she challenged, her breath ghosting against my cheek. "Tell me you don't want to know what the rest of the ink looks like. Tell me you don't dream about the chaos." I opened my mouth to deny it, to rebuild the wall, but the words died on my tongue. The rain against the glass was the only sound left when the argument stopped. I didn't say stop. The word existed somewhere in the rational part of my brain, the part that managed schedules and liability clauses, but that part was currently drowning in the static between us. I stood there, pinned by her gaze and the gray light of the storm, and I remained silent. And in that silence, Naomi made the decision for both of us. She didn't step back. She didn't make a joke to diffuse the tension. Instead, she reached for the buttons of her blouse. It wasn't a seductive gesture, not in the way people usually perform them. It was clinical, deliberate, almost aggressive. Her eyes never left mine as she undid the top button, then the second, then the third. She wasn't stripping for me. She was unveiling the evidence. She pulled the silk fabric aside, exposing the left side of her torso to the dim, storm-washed light. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The tattoo I had glimpsed in the boardroom, that single, jagged shard of black, was only the spire of a ruin. Now I saw the foundation. The ink sprawled across her ribcage, a massive, intricate piece of dark geometry that looked less like art and more like a scar that had been deliberately inked over. It was a depiction of unmaking. Sharp, violent lines intersected and shattered, resembling a skyscraper caught in the exact moment of collapse, the debris suspended in a permanent, painful explosion against her pale skin. It was chaos rendered in permanent ink. It was the complete antithesis of the composed, polished woman standing in front of me. It was beautiful, and it looked agonizingly painful to endure. "It's a collapse," she said, her voice devoid of the usual corporate polish. It was raw, stripped down to the studs. 10 years ago, my life didn't just change. It fell apart. I lost the company I started. I lost my reputation. I lost everything I thought made me me. I spent 2 years rebuilding from the rubble. I moved without thinking. The professional distance I had guarded so zealously didn't just crumble. It evaporated. I reached out. My fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over her skin, and then, finally, I touched her. My fingertips grazed the black ink over her lowest rib. Her skin was burning hot, a stark contrast to the cool air of the unfinished room. I traced the heavy, jagged line of the design, following the path of the destruction up toward her heart. It felt electric, a physical circuit closing between us. I wasn't just touching skin. I was touching the history she kept hidden under $700 silk shirts. I was touching the reason she was so hard, so demanding, so obsessed with perfection. "You hired me," I whispered, my hand flattening against her side, feeling the rapid, thudding beat of her heart beneath the ink. "Because I build things that don't fall." "No," she corrected, her hand coming up to cover mine, pressing my palm harder against her ribs. "I hired you because I saw the way you look at walls. You look at them like they're the only thing keeping you safe. You understand that control isn't a luxury, it's a survival mechanism." She stepped closer, eliminating the last inch of space between us. "I didn't want an architect who builds pretty things. I wanted the woman who knows exactly what it costs to keep the roof from caving in." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. She saw me. She didn't just see the consultant or the portfolio. She saw the fear that drove the precision. She saw that my rules were just another form of armor, same as her suits, same as her silence. I looked up from the tattoo to her face. Her expression was open, vulnerable, in a way that terrified and thrilled me. The predator was gone. The survivor was standing there, asking to be met. "I don't want to be safe right now," I admitted, the truth tearing out of me. "Good," she breathed. Then she kissed me. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a testing of waters. It was a collision. Her mouth met mine with a desperate, starving intensity that shattered whatever resolve I had left. I made a sound, half gasp, half moan, and buried my hands in her hair, pulling her closer. The clipboard clattered to the floor, forgotten. The storm raged against the glass, but the chaos inside the room was louder. It was the relief of finally yielding, of letting the structure fail, of admitting that the friction between us wasn't hate. It was a fire we had both been trying to suffocate. We stumbled back, hitting the wall, bodies pressed together from knee to chest. Her hands were everywhere, on my waist, gripping my shoulders, tangling in my hair, as if she needed to verify that I was real, that I was solid. I kissed her like I was memorizing the taste of her, savoring the breakdown of every rule I had ever written. For a long, suspended moment, there were no contracts, no investors, no reputations. There was just the heat of her skin, the taste of her ambition, and the jagged ink under my fingertips. When we finally broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads resting against each other, the reality of the situation rushed back in. We were in a glass box, visible to the sky, trapped in a building I had helped design, entangled in a relationship that could destroy both our careers. I started, my voice breathless, wrecking the silence. This is a liability. Naomi laughed, a low, breathless sound against my neck. She didn't pull away. She stayed close, her hands resting on my hips, grounding us in the new reality. It's only a liability if we get caught, she murmured, pulling back just enough to look me in the eye. The fierce intelligence was back, but the coldness was gone. We don't stop. I won't stop. But we have to be smarter than everyone watching us. We have to build a new structure for this, one that looks professional from the outside, but holds this on the inside. I looked at her, at the swollen curve of her lip, the flushed skin of her neck, the tattoo still exposed on her side. I knew I was done for. I couldn't go back to the blueprints. I couldn't go back to the safety of the fortress. A hidden room, I said softly, tracing the line of her jaw. We're building a hidden room. Exactly, she said, buttoning her shirt with steady hands, hiding the chaos once again. The rules weren't broken. They were rewritten, right there in the dark. The days following the storm were not a return to order, but the establishment of a new, more complex geometry. We didn't let the professional facade crumble. We reinforced it with a terrifying proficiency. To the outside world, the architect and the client were exactly as they had always been. Two sharp-edged professionals debating the finer points of urban development. We sat in boardrooms under harsh fluorescent lights, arguing about zoning variances and material costs. My staff saw a consultant defending her schematics. Her board saw a CEO demanding excellence. But beneath the table, the dynamic had entirely rewritten itself. We operated on a dual frequency. There was the spoken language of contracts and deadlines, and then there was the subtextual language of memory. When she handed me a pen during a site meeting, her fingers would graze mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, sending a jolt of electricity straight up my arm that had nothing to do with the wiring schematics. When I challenged her on a budget cut, she would look at me with a darkness in her eyes that said she remembered exactly how I sounded when I lost control. We were building a firewall between the public project and the private reality, and the secrecy only made the heat more intense. The opening night of the Levy Tower was the culmination of this double life. The penthouse was finished, no longer a dusty shell of concrete and rain, but a masterpiece of glass, steel, and light. The city sparkled below us, a grid of amber and white, oblivious to the drama that had built this skyline. I stood near the floating staircase, the very one we had fought over in my office weeks ago, and watched her. Naomi was in her element, a shark in a sea of smaller fish. She wore black velvet, severe and elegant, covering every inch of skin. She looked impenetrable. But I knew the map. I knew the jagged, chaotic history etched into the skin beneath that velvet. She caught my eye from across the room, over the shoulder of the city's mayor. She didn't smile. She didn't break character. She simply tilted her champagne glass in my direction, a gesture so subtle it was invisible to everyone else. But I felt it in my chest. It was a salute. It was a silent acknowledgement that while everyone else was celebrating the building, we were the only ones who knew what was buried in the foundation. Later, the scene shifted drastically. The gala ended, the investors went home, and the masks were finally allowed to drop. We ended up at my apartment, a space that had always been a shrine to minimalism and solitary order. Naomi walked in and immediately disrupted the ecosystem. She kicked her stilettos off by the door, leaving them where they landed, a chaotic pile of patent leather, and collapsed onto my pristine gray sofa. We ate takeout Thai food from cartons, the smell of basil and chili replacing the scent of expensive perfume and ozone. She had unzipped the velvet dress and was wearing one of my oversized t-shirts, her hair messy, her makeup smudged. We didn't talk about the tower. We didn't talk about the stock price. She looked at me over the rim of a water glass, her eyes soft in a way the boardroom never allowed, and I felt a different kind of foundation settling into place. We sat in the quiet, domestic space that I had always considered a structural weakness, and I found that it held the weight perfectly. I looked at her, laughing at something on the television, and realized that my definition of precision had been dangerously narrow. I had thought perfection meant rigidity. I thought it meant building walls so thick that nothing could shake them. But true strength isn't about being immovable. It's about flexibility. It's about knowing how to absorb the shock without breaking. Naomi wasn't a flaw in my design. She was the retrofit I didn't know I needed. That tattoo, the ink that looked like a collapsing building, wasn't a symbol of destruction. It was a symbol of resilience. It was proof that you can fall apart and put yourself back together, stronger and stranger than before. I used to build walls to keep the world out. Now, I was learning how to install doors. I went from building fortresses to living in a glass house, and I've never felt safer. Precision was just fear in a tuxedo. Now, watching Naomi sleep, the sheet revealing that chaotic ink on her ribs, I know the truth. The strongest structures aren't the ones that never move. They're the ones that know how to sway in the wind. If you've ever had a rule broken by the right person, subscribe for more stories like this.